A U.S.-led coalition fighter jet has shot down a Syrian military plane in Raqqa province last week. Is this action in self-defense or a deliberate attack? Why did the U.S. take such an aggressive action? Russia has responded with warnings that it will view U.S.-led coalition aircraft as targets. It also announced that last month's memorandum of cooperation with the coalition, aimed at preventing air incidents and guaranteeing flight safety, ended as of Monday. What is the future of the skies over Syria? Syria has been a battlefield for 6 years and there is no end in sight. As big powers fight a proxy war in Syria, will it eventually have a positive effect on counterterrorism? What could be the way to end the violence and secure peace? President Donald Trump is under investigation for possible obstruction of justice amid the Russia scandal.
Did you at any time urge former FBI Director James Comey in any way, shape, or form to close or to back down the investigation into Michael Flynn? And also, as you look back...
No. Next question.
It is said that shooting down the Syrian plane is a way to divert public attention. If so, could it help Mr. Trump get off the hook and rein in power?
A new phase of the Syrian conflict has begun with two military actions over the past weekend. A U.S. plane shot down a Syrian SU-22 and Iran fired ballistic missiles against ISIL targets. Although the U.S. has targeted pro-Assad forces many times since Donald Trump took office, it's the first time the U.S. has shot down a manned hostile aircraft in more than a decade. Russia, on the other hand, warned on Monday that it will track U.S.-led coalition aircraft as targets and suspends a communication channel between the two sides. To discuss these issues related to the escalating tensions in Syria today, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, and Professor James Ray from the California State University in Sacramento. Pavel Falkenhor, a Russian defense analyst, will join us in Moscow via telephone. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to the discussion here, James. What do you make of the consequences arising from the shooting of SU-22 in Syria?
I think the U.S. to attack a sovereign state and its manned military aircraft is ratcheting up the stakes a great deal. And I think the reciprocal, in many ways, ballistic missile launch by Iran also signals the growing tensions between Iran and Arab Gulf states and the ramifications for the entire Middle East.
Ambassador Hua, do you believe this is an isolated incident? What do you think of the ramification of such a hostile act by the United States?
There must be some connections because the timing of all these incidents is very important. I think the President Trump now is hesitating between the two enemies in Syria. From one side, President Trump has announced that the ISIL and the terrorists, the extremists are the enemy of the United States. The United States to fight against. But from the other side, Bashar Assad is also the second enemy. So which to fight? If you want to fight against IS, the United States has to have some cooperation with Syrian Bashar Assad. But he cannot. So when the Syrian aircraft was shot down by United States, it's a sign that United States now is making a difficult choice between Bashar Assad and the ISIS. So I think that this is the very evidence that U.S.-Russian relation is going to be deteriorating.
Let me go to Pavel Falkenhor for his perspective on the latest development in Syria. Hello, Pavel.
Yes, hello.
Moscow has responded angrily to the shooting down of a Syrian fighter jet. Now, do you think this is likely to escalate to an all-out war between the United States or the international coalition forces and Moscow?
Well, that is highly improbable, though of course theoretically the probability is not zero, but no one really wants to fight each other. Neither the Americans want to fight Russia, Russia wants to fight the Americans. And they're also, of course, taking into account that the United States is much stronger, at least in this region, and Russian forces would hardly survive a massive clash. But that's not really on the cards. This is more posturing, actually, the Russian announcement. Well, they didn't say that they're going to really target American planes. They said that they're basically radars will be locking on them, and of course that's also rather a hostile act. And with the pilot, I mean, he knows that that's detected, and there's warning signs all over the plane. But actually, Russia was doing that before. The Russian chief commander of the Russian air defense and rocket defense forces, Viktor Guminoy, last week said that Russian radars on a regular basis have been locking on or tracking American aircraft. Well, he said when they go closer than, IDA is closer than 60 kilometers to the Russian base in Khmelnytskyi, where we have all those anti-aircraft capabilities. But now sort of we say that maybe we will be tracking American planes further on, but we don't really have that capability much outside of the base. So Russia will not be really making more than has been doing already, but this was to express displeasure, A, and two, for the Russian military to have some tensions with America is very important when right now in Moscow the main problem is fighting the finance ministry for the rearmament program, which right now is in the process of being approved till the year 25. Most likely the Pentagon also would not really mind to have some tension with Russia because the chief of the Pentagon has been much complaining that the American military are underfinanced, and he would most likely also want more money.
Very quickly, Pavel.
So it's a win-win situation for both militaries.
Right. Despite the anger of Moscow, the White House has kept a low profile without further provoking the Russians. Now, having said this, Moscow has decided to suspend the communication line, if any, between Washington and Moscow. The United States says they would prefer this line to be kept alive. Now, what do you think of the importance of keeping a hotline between the two sides, despite the very fragile trust, if it ever exists, between the United States and Russia?
Well, there's not much trust, that's sure, but avoiding actual real clashes, that's important. Because, I mean, it's not a zero probability that someone will make a serious mistake. Some officer or soldier will or pilot will press a wrong button, and we could just simply go in the nose dive into a terrible, uncontrollable escalation of hostilities. So keeping it on controllable level is important. And I don't really think that there's going to be a total severing of communications. Actually, it happened before. Then soon, in beginning of next month, there's going to be a summit in Hamburg. Putin will meet with Trump. Maybe they will there bury the hatchet and officially announce that the communications have been restored. I mean, they have to produce some kind of positive outcome. And
after
all,
the allegation that is shared by Moscow and Washington is that both sides want to eradicate ISIL. That's the public enemy number one, the common threat for both Russia and China and the United States. Of course, China is also facing this common threat. Thank you for being with us, Pavel. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Ambassador Huang. It's a long speech, but he did give us an insightful analysis about why and how Russia has responded to the shooting of the Syrian government war plane. Now, Iran fired a medium-range ballistic missile into the power base of Daesh ISIL, allegedly killing some of the rebel forces there. But isn't it very difficult to tell who's our enemy, who's the friend of the United States? I mean, it's a massive, pretty massive picture.
Really, I believe there will be no war between US and Russia, but there is a real Cold War between US and Iran. From one side is global superpower, from the other side is regional power. And Iran, now really their main target is the United States instead of Saudi Arabia and others in the Middle East. This time Iran has announced their attack against Syrian territory is a retaliation to those terrorist activities in Tehran, in parliament building and the tomb of the late leader Ayatollah.
Right, 17 Iranians were killed in the terrorist attacks.
17 were killed. So they officially announced that this is a retaliation for that. Interesting to see that from the very beginning of Syrian war, Iran has deeply involved in Syrian war. Beside of financial support and the logistic supports, Iran has sent the revolutionary guards to the war. But for the first time, Iran used the missile against and medium-range missile for Syrian territory. It's a warning to the ISIS as well as to Saudi Arabia too, because when Iran announced this news, they said this is retaliation to infidel terrorists too. I think this term indicate the Saudi Arabia. So this is a warning to ISIS as well as to Saudi Arabia and to the United States too.
Well, this civil war in Syria has lasted for 6 years. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, failed to negotiate a ceasefire between the major powers which were fighting and are still fighting a proxy war in the war-torn country of Syria. Do you easily see an end in your sight? How do you forecast this very bloody conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I think as you foreshadowed in your introductory question, I think we're in a new phase because the Islamic State is in retreat after the Russian alleged attack on the leader al-Baghdadi. Mosul is about to fall, and the shared interests of Iran, Russia, and the United States had brought together a focus on the Islamic State. I think this recent incident could signal that the U.S. is looking for the next phase, which is to return to its hostility to the Assad regime, to try to build up the Syrian defense forces and the Kurdish coalition partners. And we could be facing again where the U.S. and Russia are on opposite sides with Iran and a greater violent era. And I don't think there's any solution to these rivalries, particularly when we factor in the Saudis and the Gulf states.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Ambassador Hua Limin and Professor James Ray. We were also talking to Pavel Fogelhor about the consequences arising from the latest development in Syria, where a fighter jet was shot down by the United States. That's the first of its kind since 1999, when Kosovo was mired in the ethnic cleansing and civil strife of the former Yugoslavian Federation. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Let me go back to the issue of Kurds. Kurdish fighters have been involved in the bloody conflict, and some scholars in China pointed out a couple of years back, even at the height of the civil war in Syria, that Kurds would be the only biggest winner of the war, because look at the recent appeal from Kurds in northern Iraq for an independent sovereign state. That will be the nightmare of the Turkish government. So, Ambassador Hua, your take about the future of having an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq?
You see, the Kurds were not treated fairly after the First World War because the Persians, the Turkish, and the Arabs all have their own states or nations, Syrian, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, but except Kurdistan has been divided to 3 or 4 parts. It belongs to different countries.
What's the total population of Kurds in the Middle East?
30 million.
30 million
30 million, yes.
Scattered throughout the whole region.
With 3 million in Turkey and the rest in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So I think the Syrian war has been providing the Kurds a very good opportunity to show themselves and to seek their independence. And recently, the Iraqi Kurdistan has announced that by September they will announce their independence. So when Iraqi Kurdistan is going to independent, what will be the Kurdish, Turkish Kurdistan? What will happen to Iranian Kurdistan? Of course, it will be influenced by this Kurdistan. And actually, after the Iraqi war, the Iraqi Kurdistan has been semi-independent state. They have their own flag, they have their own military forces, their own revenues, and almost they're independent from central government. So this will be a quite dangerous trend in the Middle East.
Professor Ray, here is an interesting perspective in examining the future of a faltering NATO, perhaps. Look at what happened to NATO when Turkey got angry with the alleged U.S. intervention with the coup attempt that almost toppled President Erdogan. After that incident, Ankara quickly took side with Moscow because allegedly President Putin and the KGB had helped provide very important information and intelligence report about the rebellion from the Turkish army. And look at the reluctance of the Turks to step in Syria to intervene, although it's been a member and a very strong member state of NATO. So if you put these incidents into one perspective, that what we call NATO is faltering and is likely to fall apart. At least its importance will be seriously compromised because of Turkey, which cares so much about the future of having a Kurdistan in northern Iraq.
I think the NATO organization is solid, and I think you're correct that Turkey has been an unusual partner in that coalition, but in the 2003 war in Iraq, Turkey refused to allow the U.S. to enter into Iraq through the north because of this American protection of the Kurds in Iraq. Much like the Saudis, the U.S. has this tense relationship where the Saudis have different interests. Sometimes Turkey has a different interest, but I think that coalition is very strong. But I think, to Ambassador Hua's point, I think the Kurdish people are the largest nationality in the world that don't have their own state. I think the failure of the Europeans and the Middle East partners to create a Kurdistan has left us with this dilemma, and I think it will only be resolved through an international conference that includes resolving the regional issues of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Russia and the US and the Europeans will play a large role, and China would probably play a large role.
There's no question about the political will of European politicians to strengthen their own defense. After President Trump visited Europe and urged NATO to share and increase their military spending, particularly for European member states. And Chancellor Angela Merkel said famously recently that Europeans, particularly major powers such as France and Germany, must consider seriously how to take their destiny into their own hands instead of betting their future on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I've mentioned 3 major reasons as a possible driving force behind the disintegration of NATO. Europeans want very much to strengthen its own self-defense forces. If you examine the future of NATO in this respect, What do you think of the prospects of having a much weakened NATO?
Well, I think under the Obama administration, there was also criticism of NATO for not having enough of the budget focused on defense, not taking enough combat role in Afghanistan. I do think this unusual window with President Trump and his antagonism and his even open confrontation with the French president and with the European leaders would be the moment that that's called into question. And because his foreign policy team doesn't seem to have the reliance on the legacy of the North Atlantic relationship, and in fact campaigning was hostile to NATO and even the partnership with Japan. But I think the institutions of American establishment in both parties are committed to the NATO partnership, and I think the Europeans are not prepared to defend their security. And I think because of the recent attacks from the Islamic State in the heart of Europe, are not going to be willing to lose its partnership with the United States.
Ambassador Hua, what's your take about Putin, the man, the commander-in-chief, and the senior politician who has been able to play the chess very well? And do you think with the powerful assistance of the Russian military, the civil war in Syria is grounding to a halt, if not being able to find a ceasefire and to initiate a constitution to guarantee a brighter future for this country, Syria?
Russia under Vladimir Putin is no more the former Soviet Union. I don't think that Russia today is so ambitious as the former Soviet Union to have their sphere influencing globally. But Syria is very important exception, because Syria is only strategic pillar of Russia in its southern part. Syria and Iran to be against United States will be very much interest of Russia's global strategy, and so they will keep their military bases in Syria, but not as the former Soviet Union turn this country to their colony, and just to keep their influence there.
What do you think of the attempt by President Putin to seek a kind of a reconciliation with the United States by realigning itself with Turkey, Iran, and of course Syria is its very strong ally in the volatile region of the Middle East?
Well, I think as Ambassador Hua said, it's Russia's traditional security interests in its southern frontier in Turkey, in Persia, and I think there has been this improved relationship we imagine between President Trump and President Putin, and that's led to a lot of the concern in the United States over the overly close relationship. But I think this attack does signal that President Trump is not necessarily in lockstep with President Putin, is really willing to antagonize and confront Russia's real strategic interests in this area, even at the risk of jeopardizing that improved relationship.
The U.S. government has made it very clear that it does not intend to seek to topple the Assad regime, which has been protected by Moscow. Now, having said this, Putin seems to have appeared from nowhere, because after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the Russian Federation has long been regarded by the Americans who thought they have beaten communism during the Cold War, and they have contributed to the disintegration of the former Soviet Union. Now Putin seems to have changed the perception of the rest of the world about Russia. So do you think now the whole world has to take Mr. Putin very, very seriously, especially after he has also aligned Moscow with China? Look at the very special, comprehensive and deep strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing. We don't call ourselves a partner, military alliance. We call ourselves special partners.
You see, if President Trump said he's going to make America great again, I think much earlier, President Vladimir Putin has announced this slogan already, because the only target of the Putin was that to make Russia great again. Of course, not the way the Soviet Union to have their global ambitions, but Russia should be great, and their strategic space not to be squeezed by NATO, and they keep their influence in Mediterranean and in Middle East. So this is, I think, that the plan of Putin to keep Russia or to make Russia great again.
James, do you think President Trump has been, sorry for saying this, stupid enough to antagonize almost all his allies and given Mr. Putin the unprecedented and historic opportunity to get close to major countries in continental Europe, such as Germany and France? After Putin, especially after his visit to NATO, he called Germany very bad, very bad, and that has truly angered the German media. Also, President Emmanuel Macron met with Putin and gave him a red carpet, despite the economic sanctions that are still functioning since Crimea.
Well, I think the second President Bush also antagonized Europe, and then those frayed ties were rebuilt under President Obama. We see that repeating with President Trump. I think there's some potential strategic advantage in the uncertainty or apparent stupidity of some of President Trump's policies, but it leaves other actors uncertain what the U.S. would do, and even in the case of Syria, how much it might escalate. He said in the campaign trail he didn't want to intervene in the way President Bush did, but he also said he wants to eradicate terrorism. So it seems like he's taking a more aggressive step, and I don't think the European partners who might be unmotivated by his rhetoric, I think if the security relationship between the U.S. and Russia will still align themselves with the United States, even if they don't like the person of the president.
Today, Ambassador Hua and Professor Ray, we don't have enough time to discuss the growing sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East. Well, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.